and gentlemen,
can I please have your attention? Can you dig it?
Welcome to The Remnant. It's a Remnant takeover. I'm Sarah Isgur. That's Mike Warren. And we're taking over for Jonah today to do a little retrospective on our newsletter, The Collision. We did this for the collision of law and politics through Trump, Biden, Hunter Biden, all of it. And we thought it'd be a fun, time to look back on the criminal indictments against Donald Trump, the legal side, the political side, and what could have been. Let's start with the very first indictment. This was the indictment out of New York. It was the quote unquote hush money case, but it was about the falsification of business records, a misdemeanor in New York, unless you did it for the purpose of covering up some other crime, in which cases it was a felony. That was really important because if it was a misdemeanor, the statute of limitations had run out. So they really had to show that the reason that Donald Trump said that the payments to Stormy Daniels through Michael Cohen were legal payments was for the purpose of covering up campaign finance crime or other issues. And in fact, that was left to the jury to decide what crime they thought it was to cover up. He was found guilty on 34 counts of that, though all 34 were just those different checks, if you will. All right. So what was the height of that? What was the overall take that you had before we get to where it is today?
So I think you would agree, Sarah, it was a novel prosecution, and neither of us are experts on New York state criminal law. But all the experts I pay attention to, I talk to and read and listen to, agreed it was a novel prosecution. It was seen correctly, I think, as the most sort of blatantly political of the four prosecutions of Donald Trump. I don't even think the district attorney in Manhattan, Alvin Bragg, hid that fact, made it pretty clear that was sort of his intent, is to prosecute a guy who could be the next president of the United States. That being said, I don't know, the height of it, or sort of the moment that was the most interesting to me, was the trial itself. It was revealing not necessarily that Donald Trump, deserved to go to jail, but that he basically did what he was accused of, and that there was not just that he sort of committed this fraud, but that it sort of opened up a little bit more for the public, the window into how the Trump organization and whatever affiliated companies or whatever, how they all kind of operate in a kind of omerta. We'll just figure it out. The boss man needs this done. Are we skirting any sort of ethical or potentially legal issues? We'll just kind of write some checks and ask folks to do what they need to do and make the problems go away. Is this something that we didn't already kind of know about the way Trump operates? I would say in general terms, yes. But the trial itself really, for me at least, gave some more details to that assessment that Donald Trump's, the way he does business, particularly when he's up against a wall, particularly when he feels like he needs to get out of a jam, that he sort of he takes some liberties with the way that a business ought to be run in order to kind of help himself personally. That was my takeaway from it. And I thought the actual trial and the prosecution's case sort of made a good case for that, and it clearly convinced the jury. Again, but it all comes back to whether or not this was a smart use of prosecutorial resources. Was it a politically prudent decision? I think those are separate questions from the sort of facts that we learned from a sort of from a journalistic and also just what the public knows perspective. It didn't make a difference maybe in the election in that direction, but I certainly found it valuable. What do you think?
I was not shocked that they found him guilty on all counts, but I would not have been surprised if they hadn't. because I didn't feel necessarily that they proved that Donald Trump directed the actual falsification of the business records. Donald Trump, they never had evidence, said to the guy, hey, I want you to list this as legal expenses. The team, as you note, Mike, beneath him certainly did those things. But they had to show that Donald Trump directed it. That's in the statute. I didn't feel like they showed that. The jury obviously thought it was close enough and convicted him. So, I remember when the verdict was coming out, I think most people were expecting a guilty verdict who hadn't paid attention. And so it was interesting that was one of those relatively rare cases where I felt like there's often times with these big, very salacious trials where if you're not paying a lot of attention, you can get really stunned by the jury verdict. And I thought this could be one of those. It obviously wasn't. Now, Trump moved to appeal that. There's the immunity case. I want to come back to all of that and just say where we are now, which is Donald Trump has filed an emergency petition to the Supreme Court, arguing that they need to delay his sentencing in this case, that he is the president-elect, that a sentencing like that would distract him from his current transition duties, and that he is potentially immune as well. So we are waiting for the Supreme Court to decide that emergency petition. We've covered it on advisory opinions a little bit, but as we record this, we do not have an answer from the Supreme Court. Interesting little journalism tidbit, though, Mike. There was a little nugget scooplet, if you will, coming out of ABC News. They reported that Donald Trump called Justice Alito in the hours and minutes before they filed this emergency petition. So Justice Alito would not have known that the petition was coming, but Donald Trump certainly knew it was coming. Called Justice Alito to recommend one of his former clerks for a position in the Trump administration. And so Donald Trump was calling to check that reference and see if Justice Alito really...
See, he works day and night. He's always working on this personnel stuff, the president-elect. He's just very thorough.
I can't think of any other situation where that has happened. Now, it's always a little bit odd because justices, of course, are former bosses to their clerks. And so they serve both as mentors. And as a former boss, you might have some need to provide a reference, et cetera. Within the legal profession, that's handled very, very gingerly, if you will. Certainly, if you needed to get in touch with another clerk who had maybe an interesting job opportunity, your justice would put the two of you in touch. Maybe offhand, a conversation could happen about a former clerk where a justice would be like, oh, yeah, one of the best clerks I ever had. But to have a president-elect call a Supreme Court justice just to see how much that justice wants his former clerk, to get this job, knowing that you have an emergency filing going to the court minutes later. Well, let's just say, Mike, it certainly feels like it could have been part of that trial that you're talking about, of the way that the Trump organization operates, if you know what I mean.
Yeah, I can't believe the guy who was convicted of business fraud would do something like this, knowing how it would look. It just shows you that this kind of thing, and I think probably why the jury did convict, was this is a Manhattan jury. This is well known. Donald Trump probably suffers from being a well-known celebrity a little bit, and people know kind of what he means when or what is implied in those kind of conversations that the underlings are having. This is an aspect of Donald Trump that we all know. So I think the jury probably just assumed he was approving that fraud, and that's why they convicted him. I have a question though for you, Sarah. Set aside the Alito call. What is your Supreme Courtology, Kremlinology here on what is actually at issue here? How do you imagine the Supreme Court is going to deal with this petition? Again, assuming that when this comes out, it's not already been dealt with. Give us your handicap.
So the Trump team made three different arguments. One, that Donald Trump was immune from this prosecution to begin with. Two, that the evidence that they used, they shouldn't have used because it was official evidence and that evidence could not have come in. And three, that as the president-elect, this is distracting And like a president would be immune from criminal process, a president-elect should be as well, even though the judge in this case has said he's not giving jail time. He's not even going to have, as best I can tell, fines or anything else. And he says Trump can attend the sentencing hearing remotely. He doesn't have to show up in person. So here's my criminology on this. On the use of evidence that might have been improperly introduced during the trial, that's a really normal claim for a criminal defendant to make. We sentence people all the time when they have outstanding appellate issues on evidence used at trial. So, nah dog for me on number 2.
Check.
Number 3, is the president-elect somehow immune from criminal process the way that a sitting president is for the time that they are in office? No, nobody's going to hold that. That's a real hard nah dog. Maybe so much so that they might actually write something briefly about that. So no. The number 1, though, is a little bit different, because if he was immune from all criminal process, then he would also be immune from the sentencing, in which case none of this should have happened. And that's a little different than just a normal appellate issue. I still think that they'll just say, like, no, this isn't an emergency. Like, that's an issue that can be decided later. We're talking about a sentencing hearing. Nothing is irreparable about this. There's nothing happening that we can't undo later, or that will so distract the president-elect that it can't be resolved through the normal course. So I think this will have 0 votes for Donald Trump and will probably be dealt with in, one of those orders we see from the court. The application for yada yada is denied. The end, like no noted dissents, etc. I will tell people, if we see something else, it will be the application is denied. Justices X, Y, and Z would have granted the application. And this is why that call to Alito really matters, because it actually puts the justices in a real box. Because, for instance, if Justice Alito were the only one who wanted to grant that application, maybe on the number 1 issue, like I mentioned, which is an interesting legal question, can he now say that? Because you don't have to note, even if you would have granted it, they don't have to ever tell us the vote. It's only not only that you would have granted it, but that you want it noted that you would have granted it, which is a little bit nuanced there. But this is where former President Trump steps on his own tail. Is that the podcast way to put that?
Sure. It's a corruption of like everything, right? It's like now, you're sort of corrupting what might have
to your
been
own detriment.
like what might have been a legitimate, and to his own detriment.
That's what's sort of crazy about it. Yeah.
So last question before we move on about this. So Judge Merchan says it's going to be no jail time, likely no fine. Like, so what
were we
could
doing?
this sentence conceivably be?
What
are we talking about here? Are we talking about? Yeah, he's got to wear a sign around his neck and stand on a Manhattan street corner for an afternoon.
Yes, I mean, this was the problem with this case all along. As you said, it was not only unusual as a legal theory, but because a case like this had never been brought. Now, before I get all the angry emails, I don't mean that the Manhattan DA had never brought a case with a charge of falsification of business records. Of course they have. But it had never been the highest charge brought. It was always related to other charged crimes. That was the problem here, is that falsification of business records was the highest charged crime, and the other crimes that it was meant to cover up weren't charged. That had never happened before. And so if you had just been charged with misdemeanor falsification, yeah, I mean, there's not a lot of punishment for that. It's a misdemeanor. It's sort of like a don't do this again. You are suspended from operating blah, blah, blah for 30 days. There's a lot of equitable stuff that judges have the power to do. Your books must be audited by an independent, who knows? I think the judge in this case might just say nothing. Like, you're president-elect. We went through this process. I've determined that there is no punishment warranted, and that it won't happen again. The end. And remember, by the way, there are these civil cases that we can talk about as well to some extent, but the civil cases have had far more implications for Donald Trump's businesses. I mean, remember, in one of those civil cases, his businesses got the so-called death penalty in New York. Those are on appeal still. That, I think, will be far more important to Donald Trump's organization than anything to come out of this potential sentencing.
So why is he throwing such a fit? I mean, I know, like, it's like asked and answered, like, because it's Donald Trump. but it strikes me that there's very little to be gained from making a big fight over this.
But Mike,
and where am I wrong?
So this is what I wanted to talk about next with this whole case, which is the politics of this case. All right, we've solved all the legal stuff, right? So let's talk about politics, because when you talk to the Ron DeSantis team, the Nikki Haley team, anyone about the primary for the Republican nomination, they will tell you that the day that Alvin Bragg indicted Donald Trump was the end of the Republican primary, that Republicans felt like they had to defend this guy, that he was under attack, that this was political lawfare against their own. And so if they nominated someone else, it would let the Democrats win, so to speak. That's clearly who the Democrats are most afraid of winning, et cetera, et cetera. So, if you want to trust those other candidates, this wasn't just a political boon for Donald Trump. It was the deal sealing thing for Donald Trump. There was nothing else nearly as politically effective that Donald Trump did throughout his campaign than Alvin Bragg indicting him. Okay, so then, if you want to fast forward to the sentencing now, the more that it looks like Democrats are lawfaring Donald Trump, the better Donald Trump does. So the more he can make this look like it is a political attack on him, and obviously filing an emergency petition at the Supreme Court gets a whole lot of attention. And so now everyone knows that this sentencing is going to happen. They're paying attention to it. Marshawn's under a microscope. So yeah, I think all of this helps Donald Trump and builds up this defensive wall of support around him that has been incredibly effective for Donald Trump in the past 2 years. What do you think?
I agree. I think you're right about what the other campaigns would say about the political effect, and it poisoned the well. I don't even know if I'm using that metaphor correctly, but it just made everything else and the legitimacy of every other indictment or criminal question about Donald Trump, or even political question. I mean, if you those other opponents of his in the Republican primary, there was just no argument that could get through. Maybe nothing would have gotten through had the order of the indictments changed. Maybe Bragg doesn't bring his indictment and we get the Jack Smith indictments on both the documents down in Mar-a-Lago and the January 6th stuff, the Georgia stuff, a whole separate thing. But I mean, if the order of operations is different, maybe the outcome isn't different. But I do agree that it just sort of sealed the deal for him. And like Trump, if something's working for Trump, he's going to keep doing it. So I think that answers that question of like, why pursue this? At this point, what I've never quite grokked about Trump is like, he is now the president-elect. It's like, he's at the top. He's reached the pinnacle here. He's not running for another term. It's interesting to watch my inbox when I see like Trump transition emails about all kinds of stuff, whatever the issue is. They're still sort of like hitting the Biden administration on things. And it's like, the campaign's over, guys. Like we don't have, but President Biden, is that guy still president? Like, what are we doing here? That's the thing I just will never, I don't think I will ever understand, but it's how he operates.
Hey, Dispatch listeners. This is Adam, head of podcasts here at the Dispatch. So for years, we've been getting the same request from y'all. And it was the expression of that very human desire to free yourselves of the auditory burden of podcast ads. Well, without getting into the details of whom we had to bribe and what animal we had to sacrifice to which god, I'm happy to announce that we finally have ad-free podcast feeds for all the podcasts at the Dispatch Network. That means Advisory Opinions, the Dispatch Podcast, and of course, that esoteric legacy podcast that we've been saddled with, The Remnant. All you need to do is subscribe to Dispatch Premium, our new top membership tier. Dispatch Premium offers a variety of benefits, including being able to gift subscriptions to friends and family. But I think we all know that what you really want is just to be rid of these darn ads. So go to thedispatch.com/premium and enter the code NEWYEAR to get $25 off. That's thedispatch.com/premium and the promo code NEWYEAR. May this be the last ad you'll ever need to listen to on the Dispatch podcasts.
We're moving on to the next indictment in order, and that was the classified documents indictment. Okay, so after Donald Trump announced his candidacy, Attorney General Merrick Garland appointed special counsel Jack Smith to oversee all of the current and potential investigations into Donald Trump. We knew at that point that they had already been looking at those documents, the classified documents at Mar-a-Lago, but no indictments had been issued. And at that point, as far as we could tell, they were not really still considering indictments around January 6th. Fast forward to the summer, June at this point now we're in, June of 2023. And in fact, Jack Smith and the Department of Justice team indict Donald Trump related to those classified documents in Mar-a-Lago. And this was widely seen, Mike, as the strongest of any of the even potential legal cases against Donald Trump. There was the sort of half that was substantive, that he had willfully retained classified national security information. And then there was the half that was the obstruction part as well. And the obstruction part was just kind of dead to rights. And the willful retention was as close to dead to rights as you could really feasibly be. But I felt like the Bragg indictment really took the wind out of the sails of this indictment. And it sort of just got lumped in of like, oh, another indictment. This, and from the, Biden DOJ, nothing to see here.
Yeah, there was even the sort of, right, somebody was working for Alvin Bragg's and for the district attorney office in Manhattan who had been at DOJ. And so that was evidence that this was all connected.
I'd been a political appointee at DOJ and left his job to go work for Alvin Bragg to help run this prosecution. I mean, it's not just that there was smoke there. There was like some embers and a little bit of fire there too. Sure.
But so again, once again, the Alvin Bragg indictment poisons the well. And it's sort of, to be a fly on the wall when Jack Smith found out about Alvin Bragg's indictment, I would just love to know how his team reacted to that. But look, maybe, on the other hand, if we go back to that time, I wonder as well if they thought not unreasonably that, as you said, they had Trump dead to rights on all of this stuff. This is going to be a pretty straightforward prosecution.
It felt a little bit like the Jeff Goldblum line, though. They were so worried about whether they could, they didn't stop to think about whether they should. And right. This goes back to Attorney General Merrick Garland. He picked Jack Smith as the special counsel for Trump, and he picked Rob Hur as the special counsel for Biden. Those are not mirror images of each other as prosecutors, right? Jack Smith is known as a terrier. Once he sinks his teeth into something, he will bring indictments. That's who he is. I don't know of a case where Jack Smith didn't indict the guy he was told to go investigate. And he has a long history of doing that. Nonpartisanly, I will note. But he always, goes after his guy. That's not true for Rob Hur. Clearly, for the Biden investigation, they wanted someone who had been a Republican appointee, but they didn't just go find the prosecutor, the sort of nonpartisan prosecutor who always brings indictments. And I think that asymmetry in the end bothered me a little. That is not to say anything negative about Rob Hur or Jack Smith. They're both excellent prosecutors, actually. But if you want to avoid the criticism of politics infusing this sort of thing, then they need to be mirror images of each other in one direction or the other. I don't actually have a strong preference over which one it is. But I think that was a problem for the Jack Smith team that they never quite could overcome from sort of that political angle was, okay, yeah, you can put together an indictment about anything. And we're going to see that with the January 6th indictment that comes just a couple months later. It's also novel in that they're using these very, very broad criminal statutes and then like trying to fit in what Donald Trump did in the wake of the 2020 election into those broad, fraud on the government, obstruction of a government proceeding. And of course, I pointed this out at the time, but the most egregious one to me was Donald Trump considering replacing his attorney general was part of the indictment, which was crazy to me because really we're going to now criminally indict presidents if one of their potential reasons for replacing a cabinet member might be political or something. I never really understood because that original indictment laid out 4 charges and then it laid out this story, but it never connected which pieces of the story actually went under each charge, whether they needed all the pieces to go under each charge. That's going to be really relevant because I want to talk about these 2 cases a little bit together, both politically and legally.
Sure.
When it comes into the Supreme Court getting involved and taking up the immunity case, which involves that January 6th, the second Jack Smith indictment, and the Supreme Court's decision, the Supreme Court taking the case, of course, quote unquote, delays the case. And it certainly does, though overall, we're looking at about a 2.5-month delay caused by the Supreme Court compared to the 2.5-year delay caused by the Department of Justice and the time that they took, and then the time that the trial judge took and the time that the appellate court took. The actual time taken by the Supreme Court was the shortest of all of the time by any other piece of this, but because they were the last piece of the relay, they sort of got blamed for dropping the baton. But the final decision from the Supreme Court basically said, and remember, Supreme Court answers questions, not cases. So the question that they were asked is, what, if any, immunity does a former president have against criminal prosecution? So what they said was, a former president has immunity from criminal prosecution for core presidential functions. Even if Congress passes some criminal statute that says any president who pardons someone ever committed a Class A felony, nope. A former president is immune from that prosecution because that is a power he has mentioned in the Constitution. Congress can't criminalize that power. So think the pardon power, the veto power. It's not hard to imagine Congress wanting to pass a law that says if the president vetoes one of our bills, he commits a crime. Do it, Mr. President. Now veto one of our things. Of course, they'd like to do that. What the Supreme Court says is they can't. Number 2, it said unofficial conduct. The president punches someone, if you will, shoots someone on Fifth Avenue. Indict away. He does it while he's president. You can charge him after he leaves the office, obviously. And we all sort of knew that one. And then it says, look, there's this middle area. It's an official act while he's president that you want to charge after he leaves office. I don't know. We're going to have to kind of take those as we see them. We're going to assume he's immune if it's official, but you can overcome that. If you can show that it was like a bonkers thing to do that everyone would have known was not part of his core official, duties as president, whether it's mentioned in the Constitution or not. So then Jack Smith re-indicts Trump on those January 6th charges with the exact same 4 charges, but now the story is different. It takes out that whole thing about the attorney general, and it's a much, much tighter version of events that's clearly tied to each of the charges. It's so much stronger, Mike, that I really wonder what would have happened if that had been the indictment brought in August of 2023. I think a lot of these appellate issues still would have been brought, but I think they would have been much easier to dismiss now that the indictment is clearly, every line is, this was unofficial conduct. This was unofficial conduct, because nobody ever disputed. Of course, a president can be charged for unofficial conduct, even if it happens during his time of the presidency. I don't think the Supreme Court would have taken the case if it had been clear that they were only charging unofficial conduct. I think they could have very, very likely gone to trial. You never want to backseat drive a prosecution, but here I'm going to do it. They made a huge mistake. They could have brought that narrower. It's funny, right? I'm calling it a narrower indictment, but it's actually not. It's the same 4 charges that they brought, but the story, the narrative around it is so much narrower and really only about Donald Trump's role as a candidate, not his acts as president.
So since we're talking about both of these Jack Smith indictments together, I want to back up the truck a little bit and talk about something that I don't think we or anybody really discussed much in the midst of it, which is the political decision-making or the lack of decision-making for the run-up to these prosecutions by people who are not Jack Smith, Robert Hur, and other prosecutors, people like Merrick Garland, who are sort of politically accountable through the president. How much responsible? I mean, they're obviously responsible for the decisions that are made. But I was reflecting on this over the past couple of weeks and months of how novel the whole situation is. How novel the situation is to have these sort of two separate investigations going on into a former president who is also the likely and then eventually the actual and then the leading candidate for president again, one of which had to do with his attempts to overturn the election that he lost, the other having to do with something he did after he was president. Like, all of this mixes together into like a not
slurry.
Good tasting broth. It's a slurry. Ooh, it's so true. It's a lot of cornstarch in that slurry. I have a problem just as an observer of this. Obviously, we can all criticize what decisions were made or not were made, but like, this is a hard thing for anybody to do. How could Garland have, with the information that he had at the time throughout this whole process, how do you think he could have done this better? Or was there no way to do this and everybody was just kind of feeling their way in the dark, made some mistakes? Oh, I should have done that better in retrospect. That's a question that I haven't been able to quite answer.
So let me tell you where I'm coming from to answer this question, which is I think Garland is a very smart man and a man of honor. So I don't think that he ever for a second thought, how can I use this to my or even my boss's political advantage? I think largely the errors that I can point to are errors that are, like for so many of us, right? His greatest strength became his greatest weakness as well. He's an appellate judge for decades, like by training, right? You can take as long as you want. You can really agonize over those briefs. Your job is really just to ask a lot of questions of people to
Law
the perfect
nerd
answer. And I really think that as Attorney General, his role here was to pick the special counsel. I already told you, I think he made a mistake in the asymmetry of the two special counsels he picked, though not in either special counsel. I would have been happy with 2 Jack Smiths or 2 Rob Hurs.
And just to put a finer point on that, I mean, and that is something that I don't think you could put on either. Like, it wasn't Jack Smith and Robert Hur's decisions to be selected for that, and that's not really their job to like be like, oh, you know what, you should select someone like me.
Exactly. And look, I say that I would be fine either way. I have a preference. I think it should have been 2 Rob Hurs, because I think having someone who will definitely indict the former and the sitting president is actually not the best idea in the world. I think that it's worth spending quite a bit of time before bringing an indictment like that, not only to think whether you can, but whether you should. And I think you saw that reflected a lot more in Rob Hur's report, for better or worse, as people have criticized. So A, Garland had the choice to pick special counsels, but B, there was a timing choice. How much to like whip the ponies, if you will, and tell them to go faster to get to the destination. And before he appointed the special counsels, I think Garland was really letting this play out and was like, oh, we found this evidence, but also this. Well, let's consider that more and longer. And I think you can put that at his feet, but I think it's also who he is. I think it is him thinking very deeply about the rule of law. And all of that would have been fine, but then he felt the pressure to appoint a special counsel, and then the timing was largely out of his control. So it's like he was part of the slower process, and then he's the one who pulls the trigger on the pace of the process then being outside his control. And that turned out to be, I think, a big problem, that things moved really slowly. And then the second Donald Trump becomes a candidate, now we're going to move really quickly. I don't think he did that for political reasons. But nevertheless, it had huge political ramifications.
Yeah, I think that's right. It's almost an over-engineering and then letting the machine go in ways that were not helpful or advantageous to the rule of law.
So there's a reason I put these 2 cases together, which is that our update on those 2 cases comes in one little packet. So because those prosecutions have now both been dropped, as he is the president elect. Once he is president, of course, as I've said, he's immune from criminal process for those 4 years. So the Department of Justice has dropped all the charges against former President Trump. However, under the DOJ regulations for a special counsel, Jack Smith owes a report to the Attorney General. Now, it's up to the Attorney General whether to keep that report confidential or not. But Jack Smith, I guess, has been working on a 2-volume and quite voluminous report of all of the evidence that they gathered against Donald Trump. You know, I've talked about this before. I think this is a mistake. It's not the way I would handle it. Yes, he owes him a report. He could just say, we filed these indictments. They're in the appendix. We decided to drop the case because of these prudential reasons. And looking at OLC opinion number blah, 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 dated here. Thank you, Jack Smith. It doesn't have to follow any certain format. You don't have to do all of this.
But then you can't bind it and sell it on Amazon.
That's so true,
Sarah,
Mike.
if you do that.
Okay, so anyway, he's going to send in these 2 volumes, huge reports to Merrick Garland, who's then going to face enormous pressure to make them public. Again, those are all choices. Jack Smith doesn't have to write this kind of report. Merrick Garland doesn't have to make it public, but it's all happening exactly the way it's going to happen. So Donald Trump's team files with Eileen Cannon, the judge who had been overseeing only the classified documents case, and says, stop Jack Smith from releasing his report. This is bizarre for so many reasons, Mike. First of all, she only has the one case. I have no idea why she would even have jurisdiction over this. It has nothing to do really with the cases themselves, if you will. It's about this DOJ regulation. I think you would have to file an entirely new lawsuit because this isn't part of the criminal process anymore. Second, timing-wise, this all gets pretty weird because she does say that Jack Smith can't release any part of his report, and they're going to have to go up to the 11th Circuit. And it seems like the report covers both cases, including the one she's not involved in. She did this even though the Department of Justice said they're not even going to have the report done for several more days, so she could have waited, which she didn't do.
Right.
This is the first time, Mike. I mean, you and I have talked about Eileen Cannon a lot, and I have said every single thing she's done can be explained both by bias, as everyone kind of in the headline wants to attribute it to, but equally to incompetence. And incompetence is maybe too strong a term, maybe an unfair word, but a lot of these things came in the form of delay. And I was reporting a bunch of her clerks quit. She seems to be in over her head on a few of these things. All of those could account for delay. Well, except now we have an example where she could have delayed and it actually would have been appropriate, but instead she rushed something out that also was what Donald Trump had asked for, including in a case she wasn't involved in. I feel like you can rule out the incompetence narrative now.
Yeah, I will say I am very proud of the way at the Collision we handled this Eileen Cannon issue, because I think we were, you might say we were Garland-esque. We were quite deliberate about judging things, because there were a lot of anti-Trump voices covering this stuff that were just convinced that she was doing essentially Trump's bidding. And I think you were correct, and I supported you in that. Those two explanations. But when you said to me that and to our colleagues that there was probably no other explanation, I don't know. It felt like so many decisions that she had made throughout the process sort of fell into place. And I'm not saying every single decision was she was trying to put the thumb on the scale, but it seems clear to me that whether she was just trying to help or just was trying to slow things down, it all worked pretty much in Trump's favor. And that's a little concerning to me. I mean, I guess we should be careful here, Sarah. Like we're talking about a potential future Supreme Court justice appointment by Donald Trump. I mean, but this is. I was floored by this decision for all the reasons that you have laid out here, and it seems like the status of this is that I guess so Congress will have the report, and they'll just wait out the courts, and hopefully this will get out, at some point in the undetermined future. I don't know.
We'll see. The 11th Circuit has been pretty quick to bench slap Judge Cannon in the past. She's been unanimously overturned multiple times now. So wouldn't be surprised if we get that in short order. Okay, case number 4. This was the last one indicted. The Georgia case. Also dealing with Trump post-election, but this time for violating Georgia state law. This is an interesting bookend to the Alvin Bragg case because, when the Bragg indictment came out first, I said it was the weakest legal case, both legally, but also because it looked so political. And then Fani Willis was like, hold my beer. So the Georgia case was in many ways the strongest legal case, but so infected with politics that it fell apart in the end. So what happened, for those who don't remember, is that Mike Roman, one of the defendants in that, there were 19 defendants, I believe. And like a gazillion different indicted charges. So Mike Roman, one of the indicted defendants, filed a fascinating motion in his case to disqualify Fani Willis from prosecuting the case because she was in a secret sexual relationship with her deputy prosecutor who she had hired outside of the office, was paying separately, basically brought in her own special counsel. And at first,
was
all
that
of us
wrong? Should she not have done that? If somebody had told her that sort of thing were frowned upon.
My initial reaction was, that's weird. Also, and this is both a disclaimer and a note, I've worked with Mike Roman a lot in my past campaign life. Mike Roman's specialty is political dark arts, if you will. I don't know. If you've got some skeletons in your closet as a prosecutor, I'm not sure I would indict Mike Roman. It's not a coincidence that he's the one who found this stuff. Okay, so then we have all of these hearings where Fani Willis herself has to take the stand. She is combative, evasive. It turns into sort of a Rorschach test. If you're a Fani Willis fan, you're like, yes, queen. And frankly, if you're a normal person, you're like, she's lying about this relationship. The judge in the case finds that she misled the court about the relationship such that this is the worst version of this, but I'm going to explain it this way so that people understand why she would be disqualified. That basically, she brought charges against all these people for the purpose of having this excuse to hire her boyfriend and pay him $1 million because she was going to benefit from that money, right? Because as a local prosecutor, you get your salary no matter what case you're trying. You don't get paid on like an hourly basis. It doesn't matter, what cases you've got. But if you have to bring in this special counsel, and the special counsel's basically either kicking back the money to you, which there was never evidence of, or just taking you on really fancy vacations, potentially using the money that you're paying him, so you are still benefiting from that money, then you have a pretty big incentive to bring cases that require a special counsel to help you. Well, no surprise, but that will be the update in this case. The Georgia Court of Appeals disqualified Fani Willis from pursuing the case further because of her relationship with Nathan Wade. This would mean, of course, the case is on hold for the duration of Trump's presidency, but that case could continue after his presidency. However, they will need to appoint a prosecutor from the state. And we had talked about this previously. There's a lot of reason to believe that an appointed prosecutor who would review this case would decide that it was probably not worth pursuing, and especially not after Trump leaves office in 4 years when he will be quite elderly in his 80s.
A minor sort of addition to that. Fani Willis has actually appealed that decision to remove her from the case. That just came about this as we're recording it on Thursday morning. I think the big takeaway is that once this affair was revealed, and once the process of determining whether or not Fani Willis acted inappropriately in appointing her boy toy as her special counsel, it just kicked everything into delay mode.
That case would have gone to trial. That's what's amazing also.
Yes.
It's another example. The case very much could have gone to trial before the election. The reason it didn't is because of Fani Willis's poor choices.
Yes. And it hits home as well, just when you're talking about these local prosecutors, there are the sort of politics that don't even necessarily play out on a national scale, but are very specific to that locality. And, that has a lot to do. This is Fulton County. This is the home of Atlanta. You could hear in some of her defense of herself, she went, for instance, Fani Willis herself is Black. She went to a Black church when the initial allegations had come out, and sort of gave this speech on a Sunday during Sunday services, sort of suggesting that there was a kind of a racial element to this, all this sort of things that make sense in politics of Fulton County and in a Fulton County Democratic election for district attorney, but don't necessarily help her in prosecuting this case. But I remember when she brought these charges and I started talking to folks in Atlanta, in the legal community in Atlanta, before anybody knew really about this. And there was a sense I got talking from people that, well, something like this was going to happen. That there was just a sense that like trouble follows Fani Willis wherever she goes. And I talked to one case some Democratic defense attorneys and that sort of thing, and who had a lot of problems with the way Fani Willis ran in his running at the DA's office in Fulton County. The other big racketeering case, the rapper, we don't even need to go into all those details. The delay on that case was seen as a lot of ways sort of an incompetent way that Fani Willis was running that office. So no surprise, but it's one of those things where a trial was, and probably a conviction was within their grasp, and they just let it slip through their fingers for no good reason. Yeah, so that's that. Any other thoughts on Georgia? I was just like, it's like stupid and incompetence like piled on each other, one on top of the other, on top of the other.
Well, let's spend a few minutes on the hypotheticals then, because what we've laid out is that obviously the New York case did go to trial and he was convicted on all 34 counts. The classified documents case, I think, could not have gone to trial before the election. I think there was nothing that any prosecutor could have really done to get that to trial. There were going to be so many sticky issues as long as they brought the classified documents part of it. They could have just brought the obstruction part, and that could have gone to trial before the election. The federal January 6th case, as I said, if they had brought that narrow indictment on only unofficial conduct with the same charges, that could have gone to trial before the election. And then the Georgia case, if it had been a different prosecutor and not Fani Willis, or if she had asked the state to step in, for instance, to bring this case instead of her office, which again was never going to happen, but that could have gone to trial before the election. Would it have made any difference, Mike?
You're asking me to evaluate 1,000 different iterations of an alternative universe. In the multiverse, this is like this is one specific universe in the multiverse that you're asking me about. It's so hard to know. Because then you can also reel it back a little bit. Well, what if they had brought the indictment on say the classified documents earlier than they did? As we discussed a little bit here, could that have gone to trial before, like long before the election? If that had been the only one, for instance, could
before
that
the primary would have been really interesting?
Totally, absolutely. So I don't know. We follow this a little bit. Like there just seems to have been a sense that any prosecutions of Trump were viewed by primary voters and maybe by general election voters as just political, as just part of the political noise. And in that way, they do basically no harm to Donald Trump, right? Anybody who was going to vote against Donald Trump was not, there wasn't this pool of voters who were going to vote for him, found out that he was indicted doing all this criminal, criming, as you say, and we're going to vote against him. That pool of voters was just not there, or was not big enough to matter, and seems to have motivated a lot of people, made Donald Trump into an even bigger cultural figure, right? The T-shirts of him the mugshot, kind of became this big cultural thing that I saw covering the campaign trail. I think at the end of the day, the criminal justice system was not going to lose the election for Donald Trump. And it just goes back to my bigger picture view on this, which is Republicans needed to do it through the political process to stop Donald Trump. That was the way to defeat him. And if that didn't work, then the Democrats needed to defeat him through the political process. And for all kinds of reasons, neither party could do that. And here we are, just a few days from Donald Trump being president again.
Can I ask you the reverse question?
Sure.
What if none of the cases had been brought? Would Donald Trump have won the Republican primary? I.e., the Haley and DeSantis team are saying that's what solidified it. But I haven't heard them say, I would have won the primary but for that either. It was that all hope was lost once that happened. But the lawfare thoughts were certainly hanging over Trump that whole time. He was flailing as a candidate for several months in the fall and, early winter of 2022, 2023. If there had been no indictments, would Donald Trump have been the Republican nominee?
Right. It's like Donald Trump needs that wall to be pushing against, because if you take that wall away, then he just falls on his face. I think that is, it's a good question. I don't know the answer. I mean, I will say I was unimpressed, for instance, with Ron DeSantis' campaign. I was unimpressed with Ron DeSantis as a candidate.
But once you're losing, it's hard, if that makes sense. So I think there's this moment that we can look at in November and December where Donald Trump is actually faring very poorly in the polls that we're looking at. Ron DeSantis is holding his powder dry, which is maybe his biggest mistake, right? He doesn't actually announce his candidacy until arguably the whole thing's over anyway. But it's really hard to say anyone has run a good campaign when they were behind.
Fair enough.
That makes sense. So by the time we're really evaluating the DeSantis campaign, they're scraping.
Okay. Granted, I will say I was early on the Ron DeSantis will not be a good candidate train. I did some reporting about his lack of basic political skills or early on. I mean, he made bad impressions on, say, other governors, on donors, all the kinds of markers that suggest that maybe this
He's
guy.
Not a people person. And what's his job? To work with the goddamn people.
Exactly.
Little Office Space reference for all y'all.
So, I don't know. I mean, I do think Nikki Haley grew as a candidate, and her campaign kind of grew into that role. Would she have been that person without everything? I mean, it's like, again, we're talking about divisions off of divisions of the various decision points. I still tend to think that Republican voters want Donald Trump. They wanted him to be their candidate. They wanted him to win in 2020. They wanted him to be their candidate in 2024. Maybe this is all sound and fury, and he would have won regardless, and would have won the presidency regardless.
Okay, then I've got my next question, my last question for you. Did any of these cases change the future Donald Trump presidency? I.e., did Donald Trump learn any lessons, for ill or for good, from this experience and these 4 indictments?
I don't know if he learned anything new. I don't know if you can teach an old Trump new tricks. I do think it reinforced his own sense of how he moves through the world. Again, like I said, he pushing up against enemies and opponents. I think if you talk to people around him, particularly around the legal team and the political folks involved with the legal team, they view this all as Trump getting his mojo back in a lot of ways. So maybe he sort of learned it was within him all along, what it took to win, and all of this. And that doesn't fill me with joy, by the way, to report that. It essentially the takeaway is that all of the sort of odious qualities that Donald Trump have like the takeaway he has is like those all serve him very well, and that's depressing in a lot of ways, but I think it's true. It's certainly what he seems to have learned, which is just keep fighting, never give in, never give an inch, and let your opponents make mistakes. Never admit your own mistakes. Let them live to standards that you never live up to yourself, and fail. And it worked. Man, this is a depressing answer.
What about this idea that he will now feel more free to push the limit / just break the law while in office this time?
That assumes that he felt limited. I don't think when we're talking about his feelings, I don't think there's ever been any limitation. You can see that in the way that people who worked for him in the first White House talk about conversations with him. The difference now will be that I think he is more aware of his own power and his own ability to say, no, we're doing this because I'm the president and I want to. I think in a lot of ways, he was poorly served in his mind, maybe well served for the country, by people who tried to direct him to make different decisions than where his gut was. I think he feels, and this is not just having to do with the legal fights that he had. I think the political fights he had in 2020 and since, like, they've all sort of formed him into like a more confident in his own ability to direct to take the direction, his new administration in the direction he wants to take it. I think he's still going to run up against a lot of institutional problems and coalitional problems, but he feels more empowered, and I think he is correct to feel that way. I think this is all affirming of that impulse.
Well, I think that puts a nice little bow on our. How long has it been now? I don't know, 18 months or so together on The Collision. It's been a wonderful marriage. I've really enjoyed you as my work spouse.
Thank you very much. Right back at you, Sarah. And who knows? I mean, we didn't even talk about the Hunter Biden stuff, just the which we did touch on a little bit in The Collision. But who knows what the new administration will bring in terms of the collision between politics and the law and the criminal justice system. It'll be a lot of fun. Again.
Yes. Yes.
Collision 2 Electric Boogaloo.
We'll see you next time.
No, you won't. This is my podcast.